Hey friends, tonight we take a slow and thoughtful journey through time to trace the origins of something so deeply human we barely notice it anymore. We're exploring the long and winding story of ownership, how we first began to say mine, and how that one word quietly shaped the rise of tools, land, law, power, even identity. Before we begin, take a moment to gently like the video and subscribe if you find comfort in these kinds of quiet, reflective explorations. Also, let me know in the comments where in the world you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. I love seeing this calm little community stretching across continents. Now, settle in, let your thoughts soften, and let's begin this quiet journey through the history of what it means to own, from start to sleep. The concept of ownership is one of the foundational elements of human civilization. It governs how societies distribute resources, maintain order, and define individual rights. While today it may seem natural that people own land, objects, or even digital assets, the idea of ownership as a formal structure had to be invented, and it evolved over thousands of years. Ownership is not merely a legal term, it is a social agreement. It defines who controls access to resources and who holds responsibility over them. The systems of ownership we live with today, private property, intellectual property, corporate holdings, are the result of a long historical process that began in prehistory and continues to evolve. Understanding the origin of ownership requires looking at both human behavior and historical development. Ownership did not appear all at once. It gradually emerged as humans began to settle, cultivate land, and organize into more complex societies. This transformation changed how people related to their surroundings and to each other. At its core, ownership answers the question, who has the right to use this, and to exclude others from using it. Whether that this is a tool, a field, a home, or an idea, the answer has always depended on social norms, available resources, and enforcement mechanisms. The concept also plays a critical role in power dynamics. Historically, ownership has been closely tied to authority, wealth, and status. Those who own land, livestock, or labor held influence. Over time, ownership became more than a means of survival, it became a system of control. In this series, we will trace the development of ownership from its earliest observable forms to the complex structures of the modern world. We begin with the behavior of animals and early humans to understand whether ownership is a uniquely human construct. From there, we explore how settled agriculture created the first lasting claims to territory, how ancient legal codes formalized property rights, and how the idea of private ownership became a legal, moral, and economic foundation of Western civilization. We will also examine how different cultures have understood ownership. Not all societies shared the same views. For some, land was communal. For others, it could be bought and sold. For many, it was considered sacred and tied to ancestry or spiritual obligation. Finally, we'll look at how the digital age has challenged traditional notions of property. As economies move toward intangible assets, data, intellectual property, and digital goods, the very meaning of ownership is shifting once again. Before we explore those later developments, however, we must begin at the beginning, with pre agricultural societies, animal behavior, and the first signs of territorial claims. Only by understanding where the concept of ownership comes from can we begin to understand how it continues to shape our lives today. Long before the first cities were built or the first laws written, the idea of claiming things already existed in the natural world. Among animals, territorial behavior is a well documented instinct, driven by survival. Certain species defend nests, burrows, feeding grounds, or mating spaces. These behaviors are not legal in nature but biological, rooted in competition, reproduction, and resource management. For example, wolves mark territory with scent to signal presence. Birds defend nesting areas through vocal displays or physical confrontation. Even insects like ants and bees demonstrate organized control over specific zones. These actions are temporary and instinctual, not conceptual. Animals do not own in a legal or moral sense. They simply occupy and defend. Human ancestors and the origins of territoriality. Among early hominins, our pre-human ancestors, there is limited direct evidence of ownership, but archaeological research suggests some forms of object retention. In prehistoric sites dated as far back as 1.8 million years ago, researchers have found collections of stone tools grouped in ways that suggest individuals or groups stored and reused them. These tools were often shaped carefully over time, indicating planning and preference. Among hunter-gatherer communities, which existed for over 90% of human history, personal possession was limited but not absent. Individuals likely had personal items, stone blades, bone needles, ornaments, and eventually containers. These were used, carried, and possibly buried with the individual after death, indicating a personal association that may resemble early forms of ownership. However, the broader environment, hunting grounds, water sources, migration routes, was typically shared. Hunter-gatherers lived in small mobile bands of 20 to 50 people. Cooperation was essential for survival. Social norms favored sharing over exclusion. Hoarding could be seen as a threat to group stability. Still, even in these communities, some patterns of territorial behavior appear. Studies of contemporary hunter-gatherers such as the San people of southern Africa or the Hadza of Tanzania reveal that groups do recognize certain areas as theirs. While there are no fences or legal deeds, customary rules exist. Other groups are expected to ask permission or avoid hunting in clearly associated zones. These customs are enforced through social mechanisms like shame, reputation, and in some cases, retaliation, tools, ornamentation, and symbolic possession. The Upper Paleolithic period, roughly 50,000 to 12,000 years ago, brought a significant increase in symbolic behavior. Personal ornaments, burial practices, and cave art appeared in many human cultures. The presence of beads, shells, and carved figures, often transported long distances, suggests more formalized personal ownership. These items held social or spiritual value and may have functioned as early status symbols. Burials from this time often contain objects placed beside the body, weapons, ornaments, tools. These are not simply practical. They indicate an idea of continuity, that the person owned or was associated with those items in life and perhaps in death. This is a critical shift. Ownership begins to involve not just utility, but identity. The object represents a connection between person and thing, remembered even beyond life. Group versus individual ownership. Throughout this early period, most resources were still understood collectively. Land, for example, was not something individuals could own. It was part of the shared environment. However, groups began to show patterns of semi-exclusive use. In prehistoric Europe, certain caves were returned to seasonally for thousands of years. Similarly, stone sources for tools were revisited by the same groups over long time frames. This kind of behavior suggests an intermediate stage, not individual ownership and not legal property, but a customary or habitual claim reinforced by tradition. Over time, these traditions would evolve into more formal, territorial systems. Violence and conflict over resources. Even in prehistory, conflict over resources is evident. Archaeological evidence from sites like Jebel Sahaba in modern-day Sudan, dating to around 13,000 years ago, shows skeletons with projectile wounds. These may reflect skirmishes between groups, possibly over territory, water, or game. While we cannot say with certainty that they fought over property, the implications of contested space are clear. Competition over access, whether to land, tools, or food, is a powerful evolutionary force. As population densities increased toward the end of the last ice age, such competition likely became more frequent and more organized. In pre civilized human societies, ownership was not formalized by writing or law, but certain patterns were already emerging. Territoriality existed both in individual animals and human groups, shaped by survival needs. Personal items such as tools and ornaments were likely respected as belonging to specific individuals. Symbolic association with objects, particularly in burial rituals, suggests a growing psychological link between people and things. Group customs regulated access to resources like hunting lands, even in the absence of written rules. Conflicts over space and resources foreshadowed the later development of legal systems to manage ownership disputes. These early forms of possession laid the groundwork for what would follow: the domestication of land and animals, the rise of permanent settlements, and the eventual codification of property into law. Around 12,000 years ago, human history entered a new and irreversible phase. Across different parts of the world, the Fertile Crescent in the Middle East, the Yellow River Valley in China, the Indus region in South Asia, Mesoamerica, and other centers of early agriculture, groups of people began to shift away from hunting and gathering toward a life based on cultivation. This transition, known as the Neolithic Revolution, was neither sudden nor uniform. It occurred gradually, over centuries, and with regional variation, but its consequences were profound. At the heart of this transformation stood a simple material: land. For most of human existence, land was background, the setting of movement, foraging, and migration. It was not something that individuals or even groups could easily claim in any lasting way. But with the domestication of plants and animals, that began to change. People no longer moved constantly in search of food. Instead, they began to modify specific areas of land for cultivation. They cleared forests, dug irrigation channels, and built permanent structures to store harvests. These actions required repeated investment, seasonal labor, and planning across years. As a result, the idea of exclusive, stable access to land began to emerge, not yet as law, but as practice. Agriculture demanded boundaries. A field sown with wheat cannot be walked across like an open plain. Livestock cannot be left to roam without risk. Early farming communities, therefore, began to create simple markers: ditches, stones, planted trees, to define the areas they cultivated and controlled. In some regions, such as the Levant, archaeologists have found evidence of small scale enclosures dating back over 9,000 years. These were not just practical tools, they were expressions of an emerging social reality. This land, and what grows on it, belongs to us. Permanent settlement changed more than just the way people ate. It altered the way they lived together. Dwellings clustered near fields became early villages. Storage facilities, granaries, and shared spaces appeared. With increased population density came the need to coordinate land use, distribute access to water, and resolve disputes. Social hierarchies began to form. Some individuals gained more control over land and resources than others, through age, lineage, strength, or social role. Over time, this unequal control would give rise to the earliest forms of property-based status. The shift from collective subsistence to localized production also changed inheritance. Among mobile hunter-gatherers, possessions were few and often distributed after death according to the social custom. But in farming societies, land could be worked across generations. The idea that a piece of land should remain within a family or clan became more widespread. This was not yet formal legal inheritance, but it marked a turning point in the understanding of property. Ownership began to extend not only across space, but also across time. With the domestication of animals, a second forms of property developed. Herds of sheep, goats, pigs, and later cattle became mobile stores of value. They could be traded, gifted, or sacrificed. In some cultures, wealth was measured more in livestock than in land. These animals required care, enclosure, and protection, all of which reinforced the concept of possession and exclusivity. Alongside land and livestock, early farming communities also developed technologies that reinforced ownership practices. Pottery, for example, was not just functional. It could be decorated, marked, and individualized. Certain styles of ceramics became associated with specific households or groups. Tools for grinding grain, building structures, or weaving textiles were often stored and reused within the same family units. The material culture of the Neolithic period reflects a deepening connection between people and their possessions. At the same time, religion and ritual began to take on roles related to property. In many Neolithic sites, shrines or sacred objects have been found within homes or communal areas. These indicate that the spiritual world was not separate from the material one. Land might be blessed or protected by ancestral spirits. Offerings were made for fertility of the soil or the health of animals. In this way, ownership took on symbolic and moral dimensions, linked not only to work and use, but to tradition, obligation, and belief. Importantly, not all Neolithic communities treated ownership in the same way. In some regions, land remained communally managed for long periods. Archaeological evidence from early European farming villages, such as those in the Danube basin, suggests that fields may have been allocated seasonally or rotated among families. In other regions, such as Mesopotamia, signs of social stratification and private landholding appear earlier. These variations remind us that the development of ownership was not linear or universal. It was shaped by geography, ecology, culture, and the needs of specific communities. Still, the overall trend was clear. As agriculture spread and became more complex, ownership of land became central to social organization. It defined status, power, and identity. It shaped gender roles, as men increasingly came to control property in many early societies. It influenced conflict as groups sought to protect or expand their territory, and it laid the groundwork for the legal, economic, and political systems that would emerge in the ancient world. By the end of the Neolithic period, the idea that land could be held, passed on, or defended was firmly established in many parts of the world. The earth was no longer just something people moved across, it was something they could own. And with that change, the structure of human society was altered forever. With the rise of ancient civilizations, the concept of ownership took a decisive step from customary practice into formal structure. Where earlier societies relied on tradition and oral agreement, early states began to articulate property rights through law, administration, and writing. The emergence of cities, centralized authority, and record-keeping transformed ownership from a social understanding into an institutionalized system backed by power. The first civilizations, Mesopotamia, Egypt, the Indus Valley, and early China, arose in fertile river valleys where irrigation and agriculture allowed for high yields and population growth. As communities expanded, so did the complexity of managing resources. Who controlled land, water, labor, and surplus became questions not just of use, but of rule. In Mesopotamia, some of the earliest written records are economic in nature: lists of goods, land allocations, labor arrangements, and tax contributions. Clay tablets from Sumer, dating back over 5,000 years, document the assignment of fields, the measurement of grain, and the ownership of animals and slaves. Property was no longer defined merely by use, it was tracked, registered, and enforced. One of the most famous examples of ancient property law comes from the Babylonian Code of Hammurabi, inscribed around 1754 BCE. This legal code contains numerous clauses related to ownership, the sale of land, the leasing of fields, inheritance disputes, and penalties for theft or trespass. Land could be owned by individuals, families, or temples. Contracts were used to transfer property, and witnesses were often required to validate such transactions. The state played an active role in regulating and protecting ownership, linking property directly to legal order. In ancient Egypt, land was officially owned by the pharaoh, considered a living god. However, in practice, land was leased or granted to nobles, priests, and officials who administered it on behalf of the crown. These grants were recorded on papyrus or stone and passed down through families, or revoked by royal decree. Temples also held vast estates, managed by priesthoods, and supported by taxation. Property in this context was both economic and religious. Control over land meant both material wealth and spiritual authority. Ownership in ancient societies was deeply tied to class and hierarchy. In many regions, commoners had limited access to land, while elites, through kinship or appointment, held large estates. Slavery further complicated the picture. Enslaved people were considered property themselves, and their labor was essential to sustaining elite wealth. In some cases, slaves could eventually earn freedom and even acquire property, but the system as a whole reinforced inequality. The concept of land ownership was also closely connected to divine order. In Mesopotamia, land was often seen as a gift from the gods, and rituals were performed to sanctify boundaries. Boundary stones called kuduru were used to mark land grants, inscribed with curses against those who would alter or violate the demarcated lines. These stones blended legal and spiritual authority, reinforcing that ownership was not only a matter of human law, but cosmic balance. In ancient China, early texts such as the Book of Documents reflect a similar intertwining of rule, ritual, and property. The emperor, known as the Son of Heaven, was considered the ultimate source of all land, which he distributed to nobles and local rulers. These landholders in turn owed tribute and loyalty. While private ownership existed, especially in later periods, the idea that land ultimately belonged to the realm remained strong throughout Chinese history. The Indus Valley civilization offers a contrasting picture. Despite its urban sophistication, well-planned cities, drainage systems, and standardized weights, there is little direct evidence of written laws or formalized property systems. Houses were often of similar size, and large public granaries suggest some degree of collective management. It is possible that ownership operated on customary rather than legal grounds, or that records were kept in ways not yet deciphered. As writing systems developed and expanded, the administration of property became more precise. In Mesopotamia, scribes were trained in temples and palaces to record economic transactions, boundary agreements, and contracts. These records provided not only a means of resolving disputes, but a permanent memory of ownership. Over time, this practice became institutionalized, forming the basis of early property registries. Inheritance laws further solidified the structure of ownership. In ancient Hebrew tradition, as recorded in the Torah, land was to remain within tribes and families, passed from father to son. In Athens, inheritance laws defined who could own land and how it could be transferred. These regulations shaped family structure, gender roles, and social mobility. Property was not limited to land. In many cultures, movable goods, tools, animals, jewelry, weapons were also subject to rules of possession and transfer. In ancient Greece, for example, personal property could be exchanged in markets or used as dowry. In Rome, a sophisticated legal system emerged to distinguish between different types of property: res mancipi, land, slaves, cattle, and res nec mancipi, less essential goods. Legal innovations such as contracts, wills, and trusts allowed for increasingly complex forms of ownership. By the end of the ancient period, ownership had become a central institution in the political and economic life of civilizations. It defined who held power, who paid taxes, who inherited wealth, and who had the right to speak in assemblies or courts. While practices varied, the overall direction was clear. Property was no longer just about use or occupation. It had become a legal status, a social marker, and a building block of the state itself. Few civilizations have influenced the structure and meaning of property in the Western world as deeply as ancient Rome. Over the course of more than a millennium, Roman legal thought evolved into a remarkably complex and systematic body of jurisprudence. At its core stood a refined, thoroughly developed concept of dominium, the right of ownership. Unlike earlier systems, where property was often defined by status, lineage, or the favor of rulers, Roman law increasingly treated ownership as an abstract and transferable right, something that could be held, exchanged, protected, and challenged through legal mechanisms available to many classes of citizens. This shift marked a turning point. Ownership became not only a social fact, but a matter of enforceable legal principle. In Roman legal thought, ownership, dominium, was defined as the full and exclusive right to use, enjoy, and dispose of a thing. It included usus, the right to use a thing, fructus, the right to enjoy its fruits or profits, and abusus, the right to transfer, sell, or destroy it. This triad of rights formed the basis of later European property theory. One of the distinguishing features of Roman property law was its division between res mancipi and res nec mancipi. The former included land, slaves, beasts of burden, and certain types of buildings, items considered essential to Roman economic life. Their transfer required formal procedures, such as the symbolic mancipatio ceremony involving witnesses and a scale. The latter category included less essential goods, which could be transferred informally. Land ownership was especially important in Rome, both economically and politically. The early Roman Republic had strict rules about who could own land. Large estates, latifundia, were a source of wealth and status, and land ownership often determined voting rights and military service obligations. Over time, the concentration of land in the hands of elites became a source of social tension, sparking reforms and revolts. The famous agrarian reforms proposed by the Gracchi brothers in the 2nd century BCE, for instance, aimed to redistribute public land to landless citizens. Though ultimately unsuccessful, these efforts highlight the centrality of land ownership to Roman politics and the enduring struggle over its distribution. Inheritance law in Rome was equally sophisticated. Roman citizens could draft wills, testamenta, to distribute property according to their wishes, within certain limits. There were also default rules, intestacy law, that applied if no will was made. These practices reinforced the idea of property as something enduring, capable of outliving its holder and moving across generations. Slavery in Rome further complicated property relations. Enslaved people were considered property themselves, res, but they could also be used to manage other property, laboring on estates, conducting business on behalf of their masters, and in some cases holding savings, peculium, they might one day use to buy their freedom. This deeply paradoxical system blurred the line between person and thing, and remains a disturbing example of ownership's moral complexity. Roman legal scholars, including figures like Gaius, Ulpian, and later Justinian, codified property laws that would resonate for centuries. The Corpus Juris Civilis, commissioned by Emperor Justinian in the 6th century CE, organized Roman legal thought into a clear, comprehensive structure. Though the Western Roman Empire had already fallen, this compilation preserved Roman legal concepts for future generations. After the collapse of the Roman state in the West, much of its legal structure faded, but not entirely. In the Eastern Roman Empire, Byzantium, Justinian's code remained in use. In Western Europe, Roman law survived in monasteries, church schools, and in the practices of some cities. When the study of law revived in medieval universities, especially in Bologna, in the 11th century, Roman property law returned as a model for scholars and rulers alike. What made Roman property law so enduring was its flexibility. It recognized not only full ownership but also possessio, physical possession, that could, over time and through certain conditions, develop into legal title. It acknowledged servitudes, rights of way, rights to water, that allowed people to share in the use of property without owning it. It allowed for leasing, borrowing, collateral, and contracts that made property economically dynamic. Through its clarity, rational structure, and adaptability, Roman property law laid the foundation for modern legal systems across much of Europe and, by extension, the world. Civil law traditions in France, Germany, Spain, and Italy all drew heavily from Roman precedents. Even in common law systems like that of England, Roman legal concepts indirectly influenced the development of property doctrine. Perhaps most important, Rome helped define ownership as something more than physical control. It was a recognized relationship between a person and a thing, embedded in a broader legal and social order. It was a right that could be transferred, defended, or restricted, not by strength alone, but by the rule of law. As the Roman Empire faded and medieval Europe took shape, the meaning of ownership would change once more. Shaped now not only by law and state, but by feudal obligation, spiritual authority, and the bonds of loyalty between lords and vassals. With the collapse of centralized Roman authority in the West, the nature of ownership in Europe shifted profoundly. Where Roman law had emphasized individual legal title, post-Roman societies moved toward a system in which land was held through relationships of service, loyalty, and protection. This was the world of feudalism, a layered network of obligations in which property was no longer solely a personal right, but a social function embedded within hierarchical bonds. In the feudal structure, all land was theoretically owned by the monarch, who granted portions of it, known as fiefs, to nobles in exchange for military or administrative service. These nobles, in turn, could grant parts of their holdings to lower-ranking vassals. Each person in the chain held land conditionally, bound by oaths of fealty. Ownership thus became less about control and isolation and more about one's position in a complex web of mutual dependency. This system created a division between legal title and practical use. The king held dominium directum, the superior title to the land, while vassals held dominium utile, the beneficial use. A vassal had the right to cultivate the land, collect rents, and pass it to heirs, but he owed obligations to his lord, including military support, counsel, and sometimes financial payments. Land, in this world, was not simply owned, it was entrusted, defended, and passed through ritual and duty. The church emerged as one of the largest and most influential landholders in medieval Europe. Kings and nobles often donated land to monasteries and cathedrals in return for spiritual favor, penance, or memorial prayers. These ecclesiastical estates were exempt from many feudal duties, yet they operated within the same logic of layered authority. Monasteries controlled villages, employed laborers, collected tithes, and in some cases acted as landlords more powerful than regional lords. Church doctrine deeply influenced how people understood property. The dominant Christian view, shaped by theologians like Augustine of Hippo and later Thomas Aquinas, held that ownership was permitted by divine order, but not absolute. All property ultimately belonged to God, and humans held it as stewards. Private property was justified not as a natural right, but as a social necessity to promote peace, prevent conflict, and enable charity. Aquinas, writing in the 13th century, argued that while private ownership was lawful and even beneficial, people had a moral duty to share with the needy. Ownership came with responsibility, and hoarding resources while others suffered was considered a sin. The church also condemned practices like usury, lending money with interest, which further complicated the economic use of property and capital. Medieval property law was fragmented and localized. There was no uniform system of land registration or legal title across Europe. Instead, property customs varied by region, village, or even manor. Disputes were settled in feudal courts, manorial courts, or ecclesiastical tribunals, each applying different principles. What mattered most was the recognition of tenure, whether one's lord acknowledged one's rights to the land and upheld them. Despite the constraints of feudalism, other forms of property emerged in the growing towns and cities. From the 11th century onward, trade revived, and a new class of merchants, artisans, and urban dwellers began to accumulate wealth not from land, but from commerce. These burghers, or bourgeoisie, acquired houses, workshops, and goods, often through inheritance or purchase, independent of the rural aristocracy. City charters granted towns self-governing rights, including the ability to hold property collectively. Guilds owned buildings, regulated labor, and controlled markets. As townspeople gained economic power, they pushed for legal recognition of their rights, including property ownership free from feudal dues. This laid the groundwork for future conflicts between urban liberty and rural aristocracy. In England, the Norman conquest in 1066 brought with it a new form of land control. William the Conqueror claimed all land by right of conquest, then redistributed it to his followers. To manage this system, he commissioned the Domesday Book in 1086, a vast survey detailing who held what land, under what terms, and how much it was worth. It was not just an administrative tool, but an assertion of royal authority over property. Over time, legal ideas about ownership began to develop again, influenced both by revived Roman law and the evolving needs of society. Scholars at the University of Bologna studied Justinian's Corpus Juris Civilis, reintroducing Roman legal principles into Europe's legal consciousness. The concept of ownership as an exclusive, transferable right slowly resurfaced in legal thought, even as feudal customs remained dominant in practice. By the late Middle Ages, a tension emerged between the old feudal order, based on obligation, hierarchy, and inherited rank, and the new commercial economy where wealth could be created, bought, and moved. Ownership was no longer defined solely by service to a lord or ties to land. It began to resemble something closer to what it is today, a personal asset governed by law, protected by contracts, and useful in trade. But that transformation would not fully unfold until the coming of the Renaissance, the rise of centralized monarchies, and the dawn of early capitalism. The end of the Middle Ages gave rise to a period of transformation that reshaped the idea of ownership in fundamental ways. Between the 15th and 18th centuries, Europe underwent immense changes. The revival of classical knowledge, the emergence of nation states, the spread of capitalism, and the beginning of colonial expansion. Property, once tied primarily to land and feudal duties, now began to intersect with concepts like sovereignty, wealth accumulation, and individual rights. The Renaissance, which began in Italy in the 14th century and spread across Europe over the next 2 centuries, reawakened interest in the legal, philosophical, and economic writings of the ancient world. Thinkers such as Cicero, Aristotle, and Justinian were studied not just for their style and language, but for their ideas about governance, law, and property. Roman legal theory, with its clear definition of ownership as dominium, regained influence, especially among jurists and scholars. This revival coincided with the gradual erosion of feudal structures. Kings and central governments consolidated power, replacing the fragmented loyalties of feudalism with unified bureaucratic states. With the centralization of authority came the centralization of property law. Land that was once held through feudal tenure was increasingly converted into outright ownership, especially through legal reforms in England, France, and parts of the Holy Roman Empire. One of the most significant legal changes occurred in England. During the Tudor period, the Crown took steps to dismantle many medieval forms of landholding. The Statute of Uses, 1536, and the Statute of Wills, 1540, allowed for more flexible inheritance and transfer of land. Over time, this led to the creation of the fee simple, a form of ownership that was more complete, alienable, and closer to the Roman concept of full ownership. Parallel to this legal evolution was the rise of capitalism. Merchants, bankers, and entrepreneurs began to accumulate capital not through land alone, but through trade, credit, and investment. Property now included not only land, but also movable goods, stocks, bonds, ships, and even ideas. The invention of double-entry bookkeeping in Italy and the emergence of banking families such as the Medici demonstrated that ownership could extend far beyond physical space. In this environment, the idea of property as a natural right began to gain traction. Political philosophers such as Hugo Grotius, Samuel Pufendorf, and later John Locke argued that property originated in human labor and reason, not in the decree of a king or the traditions of a class. Grotius, writing in the early 17th century, maintained that natural law permitted individuals to claim things by occupation and use. Locke, writing later in the century, famously declared that individuals owned themselves, and by extension, the fruits of their labor. Locke's second treatise of government, 1689, became a foundational text for liberal property theory. He argued that in the state of nature, individuals had a right to appropriate resources by mixing their labor with them, cultivating a field, building a home, crafting a tool. Government, according to Locke, existed to protect this pre-political right. Property was not granted by the state, but recognized and secured by it. This shift in thinking had political consequences. As ideas of individual ownership gained strength, they challenged older models of royal prerogative and communal control. The Glorious Revolution in England, 1688, which limited monarchical power and affirmed parliamentary sovereignty, was also a victory for property rights. The 1689 Bill of Rights and later legal developments established that property could not be arbitrarily seized by the crown. In France, similar themes would echo a century later in the Revolution. During this period, ownership also became entangled with imperialism. As European powers expanded overseas, they applied their evolving concepts of property to lands far beyond their borders. Colonies were claimed in the name of sovereigns, and the land was often declared terra nullius, empty land, if it was not enclosed or used in a manner recognizable to European legal traditions. This legal fiction justified the appropriation of vast territories in the Americas, Africa, and Asia, despite the presence of indigenous peoples with their own complex systems of land tenure. In practice, this often meant that land was treated as a resource to be conquered, parceled, and commodified. The charter companies, such as the British East India Company or the Dutch VOC, were granted sweeping proprietary rights over foreign territories, including the right to trade, govern, and extract wealth. Here, ownership was fused with political control. Sovereignty and property became indistinguishable in the colonial context. This same period saw the rise of the enclosure movement, particularly in England. Common lands that had traditionally been shared by villagers for grazing or farming were increasingly fenced off and privatized. These enclosures were legally sanctioned through acts of parliament, and though they often increased agricultural efficiency, they displaced thousands of rural people. Ownership, now increasingly understood in capitalist and individualistic terms, began to exclude collective rights. Enclosures transformed the countryside and laid the groundwork for the Industrial Revolution. Former peasants, now dispossessed, moved into cities seeking work. Property was no longer just about land and crops. It was about factories, machines, patents, and labor contracts. At the same time, the notion of ownership was further codified through legal institutions. The development of modern contract law, corporate law, and intellectual property law during this era formalized the processes by which property could be created, transferred, and defended. Ownership was no longer only a social or moral relationship, it was a legal infrastructure. The early modern period thus saw ownership become increasingly abstract, transferable, and alienable. Land could be bought and sold. Corporations could hold property collectively. Individuals could invest in ventures far away and reap profits without ever setting foot on the land they financed. This flexibility and scale made the modern economic system possible. Yet these changes also generated new inequalities. The commodification of land and labor created enormous wealth for some, while others were dispossessed or exploited. The growing gap between legal ownership and lived experience, between those who owned and those who labored, would become a central concern in the centuries to come. Ownership, once tied to survival and stewardship, had become a vehicle for power, capital, and expansion. It was not only a right, it was a force reshaping the world. The world changed its rhythm when steam met iron. From the damp mills of northern England to the wide textile factories of Massachusetts, a new kind of ownership emerged, one forged not in soil, but in smoke and steel. The Industrial Revolution did not merely transform how goods were made, it redefined what it meant to own. Before, land had been the great divider. In feudal Europe, your portion of the earth determined your rank, your food, your inheritance. But now, with the clatter of looms and hiss of boilers, machines became the new axis of wealth. A man might no longer need a field to gain riches, he could own a factory. In the earliest factories, ownership and labor were deeply unequal. The owners, those who had the capital to buy machinery and buildings, held dominion over everything. Workers came in from the countryside, their lives uprooted by the promise of steady wages. But in exchange for coins, they gave up something profound: time, energy, and any claim to what they produced. This was new. A weaver once owned their loom, their tools, their thread. What they wove, they sold. But now, laborers operated someone else's machines, on someone else's land, to create products they would never touch again. The product belonged to the owner. So did the profits. In this world, labor itself became the kind of property, not owned by another in the way of ancient slavery, but sold by the worker in hours, days, and years. A man might say, "I sell my labor," but he often had little choice. If he did not, he could not eat. The wage became a tether, linking survival to submission. Meanwhile, owners amassed capital. Capital meant more than just wealth. It meant the tools, machines, buildings, and raw materials used to generate more wealth. Those who had it gained more. Those who did not fell further behind. It was a new ladder, but one without rungs for many. Cities grew like wildfire. People poured into them, leaving behind ancestral homes for cramped flats, narrow streets, and polluted skies. The property in these new industrial cities took on a different form. Tenement housing sprang up, vast blocks where the working poor slept five to a room. These buildings became another source of wealth for owners who never set foot inside. Landlords profited from overcrowding. Rent rose even as wages stagnated. Real estate, too, became a domain of speculation. As railroads expanded and urban centers sprawled outward, those who owned land saw their holdings grow in value. The mere ownership of land, no matter how unused, became a generator of wealth, passive and persistent. Ownership did not require effort, only possession. But industry was not only physical. With invention came intellectual property, a new and invisible frontier. For the first time, the ownership of an idea could be formalized. Patents protected inventors from imitators, granting temporary monopolies over machines, chemical processes, and industrial designs. Copyrights did the same for authors, composers, and playwrights. These laws gave structure to a kind of property that could not be held or seen, only conceived. A melody could now be owned. So could a formula, a brand, or a blueprint. Knowledge itself became a commodity. This reshaped ownership at a global scale. Colonies once conquered for their land and people were now seen through the lens of industrial input. Cotton from India, rubber from Africa, sugar from the Caribbean. Each flowed toward factories in Europe, and from there products flowed back. Ownership reached across oceans, raw material in one hand, labor in another, and profits in the pocket of someone far removed. And yet, as capitalists flourished, others began to question. Why should one man own a factory and another starve in its shadow? Why should labor be sold, and the fruits of that labor belong to someone else? Into this world stepped Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels, whose writings would ripple through the next centuries. They argued that the true producers, the workers, should also be the owners. The ownership as it existed was theft, masked as law. that capital had corrupted the natural order of work and reward. Out of this critique rose labor movements, trade unions, and collective actions. Workers began to organize for better wages, shorter hours, and safer conditions. But beneath every protest lay a deeper cry, a demand to reclaim ownership, not just of their time or bodies, but of their work and worth. Thus, the industrial age birthed a paradox. It expanded the possibilities of ownership to vast and abstract scales: machines, factories, railroads, ideas. Yet it also concentrated ownership more than ever before. Fewer people owned more, and more people owned less. The age of iron did not melt the chains of inequality, it reforged them, silently, into the gears of progress. And from those turning gears, the next chapter would emerge: a modern world wrestling with the weight of ownership in new and ever more complex forms. The 20th century began with smoke still rising from factory chimneys and the scent of coal lingering in city air. Ownership, once rooted in soil and sweat, now sat behind desks and inside bank ledgers. Wealth had taken new forms: shares, bonds, blueprints, trademarks, and was spreading outward, both deeper and more abstract than ever before. Two visions of the world began to clash. Each offered a different answer to the old question: who should own what? In the capitalist West, ownership remained personal and private. Property, businesses, and intellectual creations belonged to individuals or companies. If you built something or bought it, it was yours. Capitalism, as it evolved, celebrated this principle. It viewed private ownership as the driver of innovation, competition, and prosperity. But on the other side of the growing ideological divide, a different story was unfolding. After the Russian Revolution in 1917, a radical new idea took root: that the people, not individuals, not corporations, but the collective body of workers, should own the means of production. The Soviet Union emerged as the first nation to fully embrace socialism on a national scale. Land was seized, factories were nationalized, banks, utilities, and railways were absorbed by the state. Ownership no longer belonged to the few, it was in theory returned to the many. Yet this return came with a cost. In place of landlords and capitalists, the state became the sole owner. Individual property still existed in minor ways: a coat, a book, a bicycle, but homes, land, and large-scale production were no longer personally owned. The ideology claimed to free the worker, but in practice, it often created a new kind of servitude: dependence on the state. The 20th century became a century of comparison. On one side, capitalist societies celebrated choice and profit. On the other, socialist nations pursued equality through collective control. Ownership became the battleground not only of economics, but of identity. What you could own and what you could not shaped your relationship to your country, your labor, and your future. In the capitalist model, new forms of property were always being created. Shares in a company gave ordinary people a way to own a slice of a business. But these shares were unevenly distributed. The rich could buy more, the poor often had none. Ownership of companies drifted upward even as slogans promised prosperity for all. Corporations, now fully formed and global, began to rival nations in power. They owned vast tracts of land, entire supply chains, and intellectual assets. The legal entity of the corporation allowed for ownership without personal responsibility. A boardroom decision could affect a village on the other side of the world, and yet the village had no say in the matter. The rise of stock markets further abstracted ownership. A stock certificate did not give one control over a factory's machinery or the hands that worked there. It gave access to profits, dividends, and influence. Millions of people could now own pieces of a company without ever stepping inside its buildings. But what they owned was not physical, it was numerical, symbolic, and remote. Alongside corporate growth came media empires. The 20th century gave birth to cinema, radio, and television. These too became property, channels, scripts, likenesses, characters. A single image or story could be copyrighted, licensed, and monetized. Even voices became valuable assets. A phrase uttered once could generate royalties for decades. In both systems, capitalist and socialist, regulation played an increasing role. Laws began to define and defend what could be owned and under what conditions. Zoning laws shaped how land was used. Tax codes rewarded certain kinds of property. New legal categories emerged to govern inventions, music, pharmaceuticals, and trademarks. At the same time, conflicts over land ownership intensified across the globe. The remnants of colonial rule left deep scars. In Africa, Asia, and Latin America, nations emerged from imperial control, often with their land already divided and claimed by outsiders. Post-colonial governments sought to reclaim ownership of their natural resources. Some nationalized oil, minerals, or agriculture. Others struck deals with foreign corporations, continuing a cycle of external control. Meanwhile, in liberal democracies, homeownership became a dream and a measure of success. Governments promoted it as a civic virtue, a personal goal, a path to stability. Suburbs were built on this promise. Mortgages became the bridge between aspiration and reality. To own a house was to own a future, but for many the barriers remained steep. Cost, credit, geography, discrimination. The dream was not equally available to all. Later in the century, a new form of property began to rise: data. With the invention of computers and then the internet, information itself became something to be collected, analyzed, and owned. Governments kept records. Corporations gathered user habits, purchasing histories, preferences, and patterns. At first, this data seemed invisible, harmless, but it would soon become one of the most valuable commodities on Earth. As the century drew to a close, the boundary between what was private and what was public grew thin. People owned homes, cars, books, and devices, but they also increasingly gave away pieces of themselves through forms they didn't understand: digital footprints, consent agreements, search histories. And so the century ended in paradox. In capitalism, ownership expanded. More people had access to property, investments, and business opportunities than ever before. Yet inequality grew. The richest grew richer. The poor often remained tenants of their own labor. In socialism, attempts to equalize ownership often led to stagnation, control, and bureaucracy. The ideal of shared property struggled under the weight of centralized power. But across all systems and ideologies, the question remained: what should be owned, and by whom? Ownership was no longer just about land or tools. It had become something else, woven into the fabric of law, code, identity, and ideology. And as the new century began, this question would return once more, this time in digital form. As the 21st century dawned, humanity stood surrounded not by fields or factories, but by invisible signals: wireless, digital, global. The land was still there, the buildings still stood, but value had begun to drift elsewhere. It floated in the cloud, passed through cables beneath oceans, and lived in strings of code. Ownership was changing again, becoming more abstract, less tangible. No longer just something one could hold or see. A new economy emerged, one built on data, information, access, and identity. The question of who owns what had not gone away, but now it was harder to answer. The boundaries were blurred. You could hold a phone in your hand but not own the data it collected. You could pay for access to music, books, or movies, but never truly possess them. Everything was a subscription. Everything was rented. Even memory felt leased. Tech companies became the new landlords, not of land, but of digital real estate. A social media account was free to use, but every click, every like, every scroll was recorded. This data, once thought worthless, became a gold mine. Not only who you were, but how you thought, what you feared when you slept. And that data was owned. It was collected, sorted, sold. You generated it, but you did not control it. You left digital footprints, but someone else owned the path. Algorithms, too, became a kind of property. These lines of code, designed to predict and shape human behavior, were protected by patents and trade secrets. They decided what you saw, what you bought, even what you believed. Yet their inner workings remain locked away, invisible, yet powerful, and owned. Ownership now extended into new dimensions. Virtual goods began to circulate. In online games and digital worlds, people paid real money for items that had no physical presence. A sword, a costume, a house made of pixels. Some laughed at the idea, others saw the future forming. The arrival of NFTs, non-fungible tokens, pushed this even further. Suddenly, a piece of digital art could be unique. A tweet could be sold. A meme could be bought. Ownership was no longer about use or possession, but about signature, scarcity, and proof. One did not own the image itself, only the receipt. The proof of ownership became more important than the object owned. And yet, even in this abstract age, older questions remain. What of land and water? What of housing, now often too expensive for young people to claim? The basics, once seen as the foundations of ownership, became harder to reach. As wealth moved toward digital forms, physical needs remained urgent and unmet. In many cities, young generations no longer bought homes. They rented spaces, subscriptions, time. Cars were shared, music was streamed, software was borrowed. To own was no longer the default, it became a luxury, or a burden, or a dream deferred. At the same time, identity itself became a commodity. Names, photos, faces, all subject to terms of service. Facial recognition systems map millions of expressions. Voice assistants learn to mimic your speech. Deepfakes could create copies of your image, your voice, your gestures. Who owned the you that existed online? The answer was unclear. Governments began to respond. Laws were drafted, regulations introduced. The GDPR in Europe sought to return control of personal data to individuals. But enforcement was difficult. The architecture of the digital world was already laid, and its foundations favored corporations, not people. Still, resistance grew. Movements formed around digital rights, privacy, open source ownership, and decentralization. The idea emerged that ownership should return to users, that platforms should be shared, data protected, and profits distributed. Some turned to blockchain technology, not for currency alone, but for a new model of trust, record, and decentralization. No central authority, no gatekeepers, just a ledger, shared and transparent. The idea promised a future where ownership was provable, portable, and free from centralized controls. But the dream was still fragile, disputed, experimental, and easily exploited. Through all this, the meaning of ownership continued to stretch. Could you own your genetic data? Could a company patent a sequence of DNA? Could your online presence be inherited like a house or a ring? These were not hypothetical questions. Courts were deciding them. Even air and water, once seen as common to all, became subject to control. Rights to river flow were bought and sold. In some places, companies bottled and sold water from public springs. Access became a commodity. Clean air, safe housing, even silence, things once free, were increasingly behind paywalls. Ownership now danced between extremes. Some owned nothing but passwords and borrowed space. Others owned entire companies, platforms, and data streams. And everywhere the sense grew that something was slipping out of reach, that mine no longer meant what it used to. In the quiet of a rented apartment, under the glow of a borrowed screen, someone might wonder, what do I really own? My data, my name, my future? And beneath that question, older ones stir. Are we the owners of our lives? Or are we tenants passing through systems we did not choose, bound by contracts we did not write? As the 21st century unfolds, the answers remain in flux. Ownership has become a reflection of how we live, how we connect, and how we define ourselves, not just a matter of law or economics, but of identity, power, and longing. And still, we say it, mine. Ownership as the story of our civilization. From the first stone claimed by a silent hand to the vast networks of code and capital that surround us now, the story of ownership is the story of us. It begins not with contracts or coins, but with instinct, with a glance, a growl, a gesture of mine. Before there were nations or names, there were spaces defended and tools held close. In that ancient intimacy, something began, a sense of what is ours and what is not, what may be shared and what must be kept. As we settled the land and sowed the first seeds, ownership rooted itself in the soil, the fence, the furrow, the field. These became more than markers of space. They became declarations. Through land, people found permanence. Through possession, they found identity. Civilizations rose and wrote the rules. Kings and priests codified what could be owned and by whom. From Hammurabi's carved laws to Roman scrolls, ownership was etched into the bones of society. Power gathered where property flowed, and those without land were often left without voice. Yet even as empires divided the earth, people shared knowledge, traded stories, passed down tools and songs. Ownership has always danced with cooperation, one hand holding, the other open. In the medieval world, property aligned with hierarchy. Land was borrowed, pledged, fought over. The church claimed not just gold and ground, but souls. The crowns writ carved rights across the countryside. But beneath these layers, common folk still tilled shared fields, passed down family crafts, and believed in a world not only owned, but lived in. With the Enlightenment came a great shift. Thinkers declared that the right to own was natural, even sacred. A person's property was an extension of their freedom, their will, their life. Locke spoke of labor and land, of mixing effort with the world to create something new, and therefore yours. Then came the machines, the steam, the factories. Ownership became productive, not just what you had, but what you could make. Capital grew, so did inequality. As wealth multiplied, it did not always spread. Cities swelled, but not all lives within them grew fuller. In the 20th century, we saw great experiments. Socialism sought to dissolve ownership into the collective, to replace mine with ours. It promised equality, but often delivered control. Meanwhile, capitalism refined its machinery, shares, patents, corporations. These became the new estates, the new kingdoms. And in the quiet of the modern world, ownership slipped from view. It became numbers, licenses, subscriptions. People stopped buying music and began streaming it. They stopped printing photographs and stored them in clouds they could not touch. And so we arrive here in a time both connected and dislocated. We can hold the world in our palm, but often wonder what, if anything, we truly possess. Ownership today is layered, physical, digital, emotional, historical. We own things we never touch. We rent the things we live in. We post our lives online. But the platform owns the post. Our faces, our data, our words. Sometimes they belong to someone else. And yet we still say mine. We say it when we see a loved one, when we whisper to a child, when we protect a memory or stand up for a place. Mine is not only about property, it is about care, about connection. It is how we say, this matters to me. Ownership is no longer just about survival. It is about meaning. What we own shapes who we believe we are. A home, a name, a piece of land, a dream, a story, a future. In the end, perhaps we do not own the world, but only our small corner of it. A room, a voice, a moment, and maybe that is enough. But still the question remains, quietly pulsing beneath everything we build and break. Are we the owners of our lives, or merely renters of time? We do not know, but we go on, holding, letting go, and saying, again and again, mine. And so, our journey comes to a close. From the first quiet gestures of mine to the tangled ownerships of today, we've traced a thread that runs through all of human history, sometimes visible, sometimes hidden, but always present. If you're still awake, thank you for listening. And if you drifted off somewhere along the way, that's perfectly fine too. If this story brought you a sense of calm or wonder, consider subscribing or leaving a quiet comment. I read each one with care. Until next time, good night.